I'm Marty Lafferty, CEO of the DCIA, and joining me for this segment is Dr. Courtney Hunt, founder and principal of the Denovati Group. The Denovati Group enhances the success of individuals and organizations in the digital era through thought leadership and guidance, research, and consulting and training services. Courtney, welcome.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. So what we're going to talk about today is the enterprise implications of the Internet of Things. And over the course of this marathon and what DCIA has been focusing on is the idea of these commercial applications of the Internet of Things. And so these are the 6 categories that DCIA has been focusing on. And really the idea is to look at kind of, how these things can be used from a commercial perspective. So in terms of the products and services that organizations can provide around the Internet of Things. But what I want to do is talk about the fact that you don't have to be a product or service provider to really think about what the implications of the Internet of Things are. And so what we want to do is think about, well, what is it that the Internet of Things means for enterprises? And by enterprises, I'm also including public sector organizations. And so we can think about kind of ways in which the Internet of Things impacts the operations of organizations, as well as helping organizations manage their utilities and their assets, and also human capital. So just to kind of quickly go through some examples, we can start with operations monitoring and management, and that's really kind of the most established aspect of the Internet of Things. So if we think about the Internet of Things as being around for about 15 years, even though it's really kind of hit sort of our collective consciousness more in the last year or so, we've really got a lot of applications already in terms of, sensors on machines, remote monitoring of machines, analyzing what's going on, implementing decisions using algorithms, and then communicating those decisions from machine to machine. So, for example, if you've got, an oil rig out in the Arctic Ocean, obviously you can't have a lot of human beings out there to monitor and manage what's going on with that oil rig. And so the Internet of Things, machine-based analysis, machine-based communication can come in very handy in terms of allowing operations to continue in that kind of harsh environment. So that's what we're talking about, and that's kind of the most established thing. It's not the sexiest thing, it's not the thing that gets talked about the most, but it's really very well established. More recently, we've now got this opportunity to think about things like utilities and asset management. And so when we think about, Nest, so people are very familiar with the idea of Nest. It's Google's, big, one of their latest things that they're going into, and they're kind of jokes about it, right? Monitoring the house, checking the refrigerator to see if you need more milk, keyless entry into your house, all these applications that people are talking about. And people are wondering if on the consumer level that's really got some scalability. And that remains to be seen. But what we do know is that at the enterprise level, those same capabilities are definitely scalable. So when you're talking about a manufacturing facility or think about a college or university, you've got all these buildings. With colleges and universities, they're either full or they're empty. And so there's lots of opportunities to use smart technology to monitor what's going on in those assets, those physical assets, do remote climate control, and do it in a much more sophisticated way than enterprises have been able to do in the past. But then we've also got applications in terms of asset tracking. So with beacons and RFIDs and geolocation services, you can now track your physical assets much more smartly, whether it's a tractor or a forklift or a car or a truck. And so there are lots of opportunities now for organizations to do a much better job of knowing where their physical assets are and managing them and monitoring them. And then, of course, we've got inventory and inventory control using a lot of the same technologies. Before sort of anywhere along the supply chain, before they hit the retail setting and all get broken up, you can use sensors and geolocation to track pallets and boxes and crates and truckloads of things. And that certainly helps with inventory control, but it also helps manage shrinkage and loss. And then, of course, with all of this stuff, we've got lots of data because all these sensors, all these things are collecting all this data. And so there are lots of opportunities, both in terms of operations and asset and utilities management, to monitor all this data and use algorithms and human intervention to make much smarter decisions about how to manage all those assets and all those expenses.
Wow. There certainly are a lot of ways in which the IoT can impact operations of enterprises of all types and sizes. But let me ask you, are the implications limited just to managing machines and other things when we're talking IoT?
No, and I think this is one of the areas that we need to start thinking about more, and we're seeing more opportunities around the idea of managing human capital. And I know that sounds a little sort of Orwellian and 1984-ish, but I was at a conference a little over a year ago, and just to take one example, you know, we think about Fitbits and Jawbones and, you know, whatever all those wearable devices are, smartwatches, and, you know, that they do all this tracking of individual activity, and we're really focused on that from a consumer perspective. But I was at this conference a little over a year ago, and, you know, there are huge enterprise applications there, and so lots of organizations are thinking about how do we use these devices as part of our wellness programs, and, you know, do we include gamification, and how do we include gamification to incentivize the right behaviors in our employees around wellness. And then, of course, if enterprises are deploying these technologies, then there's all this data being generated, and there are questions about, can we use this data to help manage our healthcare costs and, you know, help reduce our premiums, get better and more sophisticated healthcare programs for our employees. So, you know, even though we think of these things as consumer devices, they actually have a lot of applications on the enterprise level. Going back to kind of the operations aspect, remote training, distributed training via electronic means is certainly something that's been around for a while. But one of the newest areas is around these wearable devices and what they can, how they can be used by enterprises. And then, of course, we've also got, with geolocation services and sensors, lots of opportunities to manage human capital there as well. So lots of applications around workplace safety and employee monitoring. And again, I know it sounds a little questionable, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but certainly, you know, like take a long-distance trucker, for example. You put GPS on a truck, maybe you put a wearable on the trucker itself, himself or herself, and then what you've got is the opportunity to make sure that that trucker's not driving 18 hours out of a 24-hour day, 3 days in a row, fatiguing himself, and then therefore creating a safety risk for himself or others, or anybody who's using, you know, an organizationally owned vehicle. Where is that vehicle? What are they doing with that vehicle? So, and you can do the same thing on the factory floor with forklifts and other things. So there are lots of opportunities around safety, and then also using vehicular automation. So, you know, it's sort of like an extension of the robotics. Maybe you use this idea of the Google car, you know, vehicular automation to manage forklifts or manage things in dangerous environments where it might be better to have automated maneuvering than human-driven maneuvering. So lots of applications. I think we think about these things like Google Car as kind of a novelty, but really it has a lot of practical value potentially for organizations.
Understood. So you've offered several specific implications of the IoT on enterprises. Now, stepping back, what are some of the broader implications that you see?
I think there are a lot of them, and again, this is an area that I haven't seen enough conversation about, and this is where I think we need to start putting more energy. So it's really important to think about the technologies and how the technologies can be used, but we also have to think about sort of some related aspects to the technologies that really have to do with people. And so the challenges in organizations as we move forward with the Internet of Things, because we've all heard the quotes of, you know, double-digit billions of dollars, maybe triple-digit billions of dollars, and some people think this is like the next industrial age, and like this is a huge, potentially formative period in our history. And so we've got to think about how we manage that. And so when we think about the challenges in organizations getting beyond the technology, we have to start with leadership and then, of course, think about staffing. What does the workforce look like? And then more specific things like ethics and regulations and cybersecurity and interoperability. And so this is kind of a hierarchy of some examples of some of the challenges that enterprises have to face and come to terms with. And by the way, this is not just challenges. This is challenges for those organizations that want to exploit these technologies for commercial purposes, and then also those organizations that want to leverage them as part of their operations.
Tell us more about the leadership implications.
Yeah, we can break leadership down into kind of strategy and execution. And so on the strategy side, of course, you need leaders who are doing the environmental scanning, who are digitally literate, who understand the world in which they're operating and can think about things like what are our new business development opportunities here, what are the potential competitive threats, how can we leverage the Internet of Things to improve our operational efficiencies, and then, of course, thinking about the human capital resources. What does this mean in terms of what our human capital management needs and priorities are? So they've got to have their heads up, and they've got to be thinking big picture, longer term, holistically and strategically. But they also need to think about, you know, the tactical side and the execution side. And so what kind of financial resources do we need to allocate? What kind of planning do we need to do, both in the short and the longer term? You know, is our staff prepared? What do we need to do to make sure they have the training and they are properly developed to leverage these technologies and manage these technologies effectively? And one of the big ones that I think is crucial is this whole idea of governance. Because what governance looks like in the industrial era and what governance looks like in the digital era, and particularly as we move forward with the Internet of Things, is not the same. So there's some things that we can take in terms of policies, procedures, processes, the governance aspects from the industrial era and translate them, move them forward. But there are other aspects of governance that are brand new. And so I could talk about that at length, but really governance is crucial to figuring out the right way to both exploit these technologies for commercial purposes and especially to implement them inside organizations. So these are some of the things that leaders need to be thinking about as we move forward.
Right, right. And what did you mean when you referred to staffing implications earlier?
Yeah, so staffing we can break down into kind of two categories. What are the kinds of roles and responsibilities that organizations need? So they need to look at what the workforce composition should be as they go forward. And again, this is particularly true for organizations that want to offer products and services related to the Internet of Things, but it's also true for organizations that are leveraging the Internet of Things as part of their operations. And so some of the capabilities or some of the roles and needs that you see here are things like industrial design, user experience, user interface, and then, of course, data management and analytics, visualizations, and business intelligence. So there are all these roles related to creating and managing the Internet of Things that need to be filled. And then, of course, those then translate into a set of capabilities, and there certainly are levels of expertise and capabilities related to those roles, but we also have a broader set of capabilities that are required in organizations. And what we're talking about here is kind of this idea of digital transformation of organizations of all types. And as an organization becomes digitally transformed, it means that digital sort of imbues everything in terms of the operations. And so all employees need to have high levels of digital literacy. They need to be able to communicate and collaborate more effectively. They need to be very innovative in systems thinking because, you know, it's no longer kind of this siloed, separate approach. It really is much more fully integrated. And so employees have to have capabilities that actually meld well with a new form of business operation.
Absolutely. So what were some of the key ethical and regulatory considerations that you wanted to share with us?
So here's just a couple examples, and these are big things that we're seeing being talked about in the media. You know, one of the biggest ones is how do we balance commercial and social interests? The commercial, potential of the Internet of Things is very significant, But as we've already seen over the last 5 to 10 years, you can exploit technology in a way that is potentially harmful to people. And so what we need to do is find a balance where we can exploit these technologies in a way that does not create, sort of irreversible excessive harm. And 2 examples of where that harm could occur around privacy and jobs. And so with privacy, of course, there are the privacy rights of individual employees, of consumers, of the public at large. Because, with the Internet of Things, you just can collect all this data. And there are no limits, technological limits, to what data gets collected, how much of it gets collected, what gets done with it. And so we have to think about where do we draw the line in terms of respecting the privacy of the individuals. And so that's a huge consideration. We have no precedent for this, really. We have to think about how we manage this going forward. And then, of course, as machines get smarter and are able to do more and more things, we have the potential of job loss. And, of course, we've been there before in terms of, okay, so machines get smarter, that means we need fewer people to do things like farming. With farm machines, farm labor went way down. Those people then moved into new jobs. The question is, are we going to have the new kinds of jobs for people to move into as machines get smarter, and what do those jobs look like? So all those are another big set of issues, and kind of both of those lead into the other aspect, which is the legal landscape. So where do we balance sort of self-regulation, organizations and their leaders deciding things on their own and managing these things on their own, and where does the government step in? And, how, again, do we find that right balance between what organizations should be doing to self-regulate and what the government needs to do to kind of help manage all this? We don't have answers to those questions either. They're really important to think about. And then, of course, for leaders in organizations, you got to stay current because the regulations themselves are going to take a while to get created. So most of the law is going to be created through case law. And so leaders need to be paying attention to what's happening in terms of case law to understand where the lines are being drawn because they're constantly being redrawn.
Excellent point, excellent point. What about interoperability and cybersecurity in this instance?
And that's very kind of well established. Doesn't mean we have all the answers, but we know it's an important issue to think about things like integrated, holistic, and systemic solutions and making sure that, these different systems can talk to each other, data gets transferred efficiently and effectively, et cetera. And then, of course, we've got the cloud decision. So where do you put things on a server? Where do you put things in a private cloud? When do you put things in a public cloud? And then how do you move things around, right? So you've got these layers of sort of networks, and you've got to decide where things belong and when they belong there and how you use all that. So that's a new level of management. And then, of course, you've got to keep up with the hackers. Notice I don't say you've got to get ahead of the hackers because it doesn't seem to be possible, but you've got to keep up with the hackers and make sure that you're keeping things protected. But really with all of this, I think we also have to think about the human side of all this as well. So not just the technology side, but the human side. And what do you need, again, in terms of leadership and staffing to make sure that you're keeping up with the interoperability and cybersecurity challenges. And then a new dimension, of course, is managing digital era risks more broadly. So not just thinking about the machines, but the people. And, with the Target hacking situation, that's not necessarily Internet of Things, but, that it seemed like the weak link there had to do with vendor security. And we're seeing that with a lot more organizations. So an organization can try to be really tight in terms of cybersecurity internally, but they're very weak in terms of managing third parties, whether it's a vendor or a service provider, and that seems to be how a lot of hackers are getting in or how a lot of weakness is being created. And so organizations need to be thinking about that, and then also with their employees. What do the employment contracts look like? What are their policies and procedures? So this is where we're looking at the human side of interoperability and cybersecurity in particular to make sure that risks are managed in the most efficient and effective way possible.
You've taken us through a lot. So what do you think is the major single key to moving forward?
Well, it reflects my bias, but I believe technology adoption and adaptation are fundamentally human endeavors. And I think that's what we have to really think about. It doesn't mean that technology is not important, but really we've got to think about the human aspect of this. And when I say the human aspect, I mean individual humans, but also human systems. So when we talk about things like privacy and jobs and the societal implications, these are all human systems. And so we need to make sure that we're thinking about how those human systems need to be managed and what we need to do about the people within those human systems. And so, there are alarmists who will talk a lot about the risks in terms of job loss, in terms of privacy loss, in terms of identity theft, in terms of all these kind of individual level and systemic risks that the Internet of Things can create. And those are all true, but progress is never frictionless. So I think it's a myth to think that we can move forward without any challenges and without any friction. But what we have to remember is that the solutions to those things really boil down to people. Strong leadership, good staffing, an appropriate approach to sort of the morals of all of this, the moral implications, the societal implications. And so to me, that's what's really key. That, if we want to avoid a matrix kind of situation or an Orwellian situation, it really does boil down to the people, both in terms of leaders and individuals and in terms of human systems. So we can't forget the people as we move forward with all this technology.
Courtney Hunt, I want to thank you for joining us and for your very insightful views on the enterprise implications of the Internet of Things. Thank you.